You don't get this kind of training where you can actually invade a human body unless you've had some surgical experience, in my opinion.
So you're saying you think it must have been a doctor?
In my opinion, yes.
The Black Dahlia mystery has spawned countless theories, but only one comes from a detective who worked the case and had access to the secret files. This detective, Steve Hodel, claimed the answer was simple and terrifying. He believed his own father was the culprit.
She had been found at a vacant lot posed and surgically bisected. My father had been a surgeon in his early years of doctoring, so he certainly had that ability.
Just before he passed, Hodel made his final statement, a confession of what he knew and what the department allegedly covered up. We're about to unpack the deathbed revelation of a retired cop who broke the code of silence to name his father as America's most notorious monster. The ghastly performance. It was a cold, bright Wednesday morning in Los Angeles, January 15, 1947. A young mother, Betty Bersinger, was walking down Norton Avenue, pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller. They were cutting through the quiet, undeveloped neighborhood of Leimert Park, an area of mostly empty lots and overgrown weeds, a scar of land waiting for the post-war boom to fill it in. It was just after 10 a.m. and the air was still. As she passed one of these vacant lots, something white in the tall grass caught her eye. At first glance, she thought it was a discarded store mannequin. You know, the kind you see in department store windows, probably broken in half and dumped by a fed-up shop owner. It was pale, unnervingly still, and looked almost like plastic. But here's the catch. As she got closer, a few steps more, the morning light hit the object just right. A fly landed. A dreadful sinking feeling hit her stomach. This was no mannequin. This was something from the deepest, darkest part of a nightmare. What Betty Bersinger had found would become the most infamous, most obsessed over unsolved crime in American history. It was the body of a young woman posed in a grotesque and deliberate way that defied all logic. The crazy part is the body was completely severed at the waist. The two halves were placed about a foot apart, positioned with a horrifying artistic precision. Her arms were raised above her head, bent at the elbows. Her legs were spread wide, but the horror didn't stop there. Her body had been prepared. It was scrubbed clean, shockingly pale. It had been drained of every single drop of its lifeblood. There wasn't a speck of blood on the grass around her, not a drop on her skin. This meant the horrific act had happened somewhere else, somewhere secret, before she was brought here for this specific, horrifying display. And then there was her face. The perpetrator had carved a gruesome ear-to-ear smile onto her features, a horrific jagged cut that would later be known as a Glasgow smile. It was a macabre, clown-like grin frozen in time. The police arrived, and even these hardened, cynical Los Angeles cops were stunned into silence. They had seen terrible things in the sprawling, chaotic city, but they had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a ritual. This was a performance. The victim was quickly identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, an aspiring actress from Massachusetts who had drifted to Hollywood searching for fame like so many others. The scene itself was a puzzle. Besides the lack of lifeblood, there were rope marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck, showing she had been held captive, likely for several days. There was also a strange, cross-hatched pattern on one of her hips, as if she'd been pressed against a coarse weave bag. The autopsy revealed even more disturbing details. The bisection was shockingly precise. It was a hemidus articulation, a surgical procedure that severed the body between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. This wasn't a frenzied hack job with an axe. This was the work of someone with anatomical knowledge, someone with the steady, practiced hands of a surgeon. The cuts to her face were also done with precision. The person responsible wanted to create a specific, horrifying work of art. What most people don't realize is that Elizabeth Short wasn't a star. She wasn't even close. She was just one of thousands of young women trying to make it in post-war Los Angeles, a city bursting with dreams and darkness. She worked as a waitress, dated servicemen, and floated between apartments and rooming houses. She was known for her striking appearance, particularly her dark, bouffant hair and her preference for black clothing, which earned her a nickname that would soon become immortal. But in that moment, in that vacant lot, she was a terrifying symbol of Hollywood's dark, predatory side. The city was about to be gripped by a panic unlike anything it had ever seen, all because of this single ghastly performance. The search for the person responsible would consume the LAPD, but the perpetrator, this invisible surgical monster, was just getting started. The city was horrified, but the person responsible wasn't done. The real performance was just beginning. Letters from a monster. The moment the story hit the wires, it wasn't just news, it was a firestorm. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon and the real-life Citizen Kane, saw the sensationalism immediately. This case had everything: a beautiful victim, the allure of Hollywood, and a shockingly gruesome act. Hearst personally ordered his papers, the Los Angeles Examiner and the Los Angeles Herald-Express, to go all in. And get this, the press immediately went to work creating a legend. Reporters descended on the case, digging into every corner of Elizabeth Short's life. Often inventing details wholesale, they portrayed her as a mysterious woman in black, a drifter who lured men, a femme fatale who got in too deep. Most of this was pure, cynical fiction designed to sell papers. It was the press, not the police, who gave her the name that would stick forever: the Black Dahlia. At the time, a popular film noir called The Blue Dahlia, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake, was in theaters. The nickname, swapping blue for black to match her dark hair and clothing, was a perfect dark twist. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a character, a ghost haunting the city. The media frenzy turned the investigation into a complete circus. The crime scene in Leimert Park was contaminated almost immediately, with reporters and crowds of onlookers trampling over any potential evidence, desperate for a glimpse of the horror. Then the taunts began. This is where it gets chilling. About a week after the discovery, the Examiner received a phone call. The man on the line had a calm, measured voice. He claimed to be the one responsible. He told the editor he was worried the police weren't taking him seriously and that he would be mailing them proof. So here's the deal. On January 24th, a package arrived at the newspaper office. Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal items: her birth certificate, her social security card, old photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The entire package had been carefully, methodically cleaned with gasoline, wiping away any and all fingerprints. The sender had also used cut and pasted letters from magazines and newspapers to write a note, which read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." This package sent the police into a spin. The address book, with its dozens of names, sent detectives on a wild goose chase all over the city. But it was likely a plant, another red herring from a perpetrator who was toying with them. The crazy part is, the taunts didn't stop. More letters arrived, composed of the same cutout letters, continuing to mock the police. The LAPD was drowning. They investigated hundreds, then thousands of men. The suspect list grew to an unmanageable size. What most people don't realize is that over 60 people confessed to the crime. Every single one of them was found to be a false confessor. People desperate for attention, suffering from mental health issues, or just trying to get a free meal in a holding cell. And this is where the wild theories began to bloom. The LAPD was so desperate, they looked everywhere. One theory that gained real traction was the Mad Butcher of Cleveland. From 1935 to 1938, a serial culprit in Cleveland, Ohio, had taken the lives of at least 12 people, many of whom were dismembered. The famous lawman Eliot Ness, the man who took down Al Capone, was the safety director in Cleveland at the time and was famously taunted by the Butcher. The similarities were startling. Was it possible the Cleveland Butcher had moved to Los Angeles? Then there was an even wilder theory, one that pointed to the very heart of Hollywood's creative genius: Orson Welles. Yeah, about that. The Citizen Kane director was known for his dark fascinations and his turbulent personal life. In the mid-40s, he had a magic act in his traveling show, which sometimes featured his then-wife, Rita Hayworth. One of his most famous illusions? Sawing a woman in half on stage. Detractors pointed to Wells's artwork, his funhouse sets, and his known psychological issues as proof. They claimed the entire crime scene was a twisted piece of performance art from a troubled genius. It was a wild, compelling theory, but it was built entirely on circumstantial feelings. The investigation was, and that's putting it lightly, a mess. The 1940s LAPD was notoriously corrupt. A cesspool of bribery and backroom deals. The Brenda Allen scandal, where a high-class madam's address book implicated half the department, was about to explode. The police were more interested in image control than in solving a case that was this bizarre. They chased leads that went nowhere. They focused on Elizabeth's lifestyle, trying to paint her as a party girl who got what was coming to her rather than focusing on the one terrifying clue that mattered most: the surgical precision of the act. The case grew colder and colder, eventually freezing solid, becoming the stuff of Hollywood legend. The case went cold for decades until one man started looking not at the files, but at his family photo album, The Hodel Family Secret. Decades passed. The Black Dahlia case became a dark fairy tale, a warning, a mystery that defined Los Angeles. Dozens of books and movies were made, each pointing a finger at a different suspect. The original detectives retired or passed away. The case files, now containing thousands of pages, gathered dust in an archive. Then, in 1999, a man named George Hodel passed away. This event wouldn't make headlines. He was just another wealthy, elderly doctor passing away at the age of 91 in San Francisco. But his passing was the key that would unlock the entire mystery. So here's the deal. George Hodel's son was a man named Steve Hodel. And Steve wasn't just anybody. He was a decorated 24-year veteran of the LAPD. He was a homicide detective who had worked over 300 cases. He was a cop's cop, respected, tough, and retired. After his father's passing, Steve was given the task of going through his father's belongings. He found a small old photo album, the kind with black paper pages. As he flipped through the pages, looking at old family photos, he stopped. His blood ran cold. Staring back at him were two photographs of a beautiful dark-haired young woman. Steve Hodel, the homicide cop, recognized her instantly. It was Elizabeth Short. It was a what-if moment that sent a chill down his spine. Why would his father, a man he had a complicated and distant relationship with, have photographs of the Black Dahlia? They weren't newspaper clippings, they were personal photos. Steve started digging. He wasn't just a grieving son anymore, he was a detective on the biggest case of his life, and the suspect was his own father. He began to look at his father, Dr. George Hodel, not as a parent, but as a potential perpetrator. And the more he looked, the more the pieces fit into a horrifying picture. George Hodel wasn't a normal father. He was a certified genius, with an IQ rumored to be an astronomical 186. He was a musical child prodigy, but he had a dark side, a very dark side. He was a brilliant physician, a surgeon who specialized in venereal diseases, running a clinic in Los Angeles. He was also a part of the high society surrealist art scene. He was friends with the famous artist Man Ray and the writer Henry Miller. This is where it gets chilling. Steve Hodel, with his cop's eye, remembered the Black Dahlia crime scene photos, the way Elizabeth Short's body was posed, the bisection, the raised arms. He started looking at his father's friend, Man Ray's artwork. He found a piece called L'amour fou, or Mad Love. He saw photographs by Man Ray, like the Minotaur, which showed a female torso, arms raised. The similarities were undeniable. The crime scene wasn't just a random pose, it was a direct, horrifying copy of the surrealist art his father was obsessed with. The crime, Steve realized, wasn't a random act of rage. It was a surrealist masterpiece. Steve also remembered his childhood. He remembered his father's Faustian vanity, as he called it. His father saw himself as above morality, an Übermensch who could create and destroy as he pleased. He remembered his father's cold, calculating nature, and he remembered his father's medical training. Who else could perform a perfect hemicorporectomy in the 1940s? A highly skilled surgeon. The kind of surgeon who would also know how to drain a body of its lifeblood, possibly using his X-ray equipment, a popular but bizarre medical treatment at the time. While Steve was building this case, he also looked back at the original suspects. What about Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose name was on the address book sent to the press? Hansen was a major suspect. He knew Elizabeth, she had even stayed at his home briefly, but he had a solid alibi and the police eventually cleared him. It seemed more and more likely that the address book was a deliberate plant left by someone who knew Hansen and wanted to point the police in the wrong direction. Steve Hodel had the photos. He had the connection to surrealist art. He had the medical motive. He was a cop, and this was starting to look like probable cause, but he needed more. He needed to know if the 1947 LAPD had ever looked at his father. Steve had photos and a hunch, but he needed proof. He found it buried deep in the LAPD's most secret files, a doctor's dark boasts. Steve Hodel used his old LAPD connections to do what no civilian, no journalist, and no author had ever done. He accessed the original secret Black Dahlia case files. He went to the district attorney's office, and what he found was a bombshell. His father, Dr. George Hodel, hadn't just been a person of interest, he had been the prime suspect in 1949. But here's the catch. The entire investigation was shut down, and the files were buried so deep they were almost lost to history. The LAPD back in the day had been investigating George Hodel. They suspected him of a number of crimes, including the disappearance of his own secretary. But the trail kept leading them to one place, his home. This house wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. Known as the Soden House, it was an architectural landmark in Hollywood, designed by Lloyd Wright, the son of the famous Frank Lloyd Wright. It looked like a massive concrete Mayan temple. It was built around a central courtyard with a forbidding block-like facade. It was a place of wild, lavish parties, a hub for the surrealist art scene, and police suspected a place of dark secrets. The police believed this was where the horrific act against Elizabeth Short took place. The house had large rooms with concrete floors and drains, perfect for a surgeon who needed to clean up a very messy scene. And get this, in 1950, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, along with a special gangster squad of the LAPD, planted bugs inside the Soden House. They were desperate. They listened to George Hodel's every word for weeks. Steve Hodel, the retired cop, found the original typewritten transcripts from those wiretaps. And they were the smoking gun. In one recording, Hodel is heard talking to an unknown associate about the police who were digging in his backyard. He says, quote, "Supposing I did dispatch the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's departed." He didn't just stop there. In another recording, the detectives listening in heard a woman scream. They believed Hodel was in the middle of another assault, but by the time they arrived at the Mayan temple, the house was silent. He had outsmarted them. The wiretaps also caught Dr. Hodel talking about paying off police officers. He was heard discussing bribes, naming names, and talking about his connections high up in the department. This wasn't just a monster, this was a monster who was deeply embedded in the corrupt system. At the same time, the police were also chasing another hot suspect, a man named Leslie Dillon. He was a bellhop and an aspiring writer who seemed to know way too much about the case. For a while, the police thought Dillon was their man, but he too was eventually let go. It was another dead end, possibly another distraction. But the Hodel file was different. The evidence was overwhelming. They had a suspect with the surgical skill. They had a suspect connected to the surrealist art that matched the crime scene. They had a suspect who, Steve Hodel believes, knew the victim through his clinic. And now they had a wiretap transcript of him practically admitting to it. The DA at the time, Steve found, was preparing a file. They were preparing to arrest Dr. George Hodel. So here's the deal. Just as the net was closing in, George Hodel did something very strange. He suddenly fled the country. He abandoned his family, his practice, and his Mayan temple. He moved to Hawaii and then to Asia, where he lived for the next 40 years. He only returned to America when he was an old man, long after the case was cold and the LAPD. Instead of pursuing him, instead of seeking extradition, they shut down the wiretaps. They buried the transcripts. The case against their #1 suspect was quietly dropped. The Black Dahlia case was officially put back in the unsolved box. Steve Hodel finally understood. His father hadn't just gotten away with it. He was protected. The evidence was overwhelming. So why wasn't he arrested? The answer is the real confession. The truth at the end. For over 75 years, one name has been whispered in the dark corners of Los Angeles: the Black Dahlia. The brutal, gruesome murder of Elizabeth Short in 1947 is more than a cold case. It's an American obsession, a Hollywood nightmare that has never ended. The theories are a dime a dozen. Every armchair detective and Hollywood historian has a suspect. But most people only ever hear the whispers, the smoke and mirrors. The thing is, the sheer number of wild theories is what has kept this case cold for so long. They are so bizarre, so tantalizing, that they've created a fog of confusion. The Hollywood Sorcerer. Let's start with one of the wildest theories, one that sounds like it was ripped straight from a movie script, The Suspect. None other than the legendary filmmaker and magician Orson Welles. Stay with me. This theory, championed by writer Mary Pacios, suggests that Welles, the genius behind Citizen Kane, was a man with a dark, fractured mind. In the mid-1940s, Welles was deep into magic and illusion, and his obsession was the sawing a woman in half trick. He performed it on stage night after night. But what if the theory goes it stopped being an illusion? And get this, Welles absolutely knew Elizabeth Short. She was a face in the Hollywood crowd and their paths crossed. But here's the wow factor that makes this theory so chilling. Welles was a huge fan of the surrealist art movement, and his close friend was the artist Man Ray. If you look at Man Ray's most famous paintings from that time, like Minotaur or The Lovers, you see something terrifying. You see canvases depicting visages with a horrific slashed smile. A smile that looks almost identical to the Glasgow smile carved into Elizabeth Short's face. Was it a coincidence? Or was the entire horrific murder scene a piece of performance art, a surrealist masterpiece created by a troubled genius? It's a terrifying thought, but ultimately it's a theory built on art and shadows. There was never a single piece of hard evidence, and the theory fizzled out. The man who knew too much. Then there's the strange case of Leslie Dillon. Dillon wasn't a celebrity. He was a bellhop and aspiring writer who in 1949 seemed to be on the fringes of the investigation. He was an acquaintance of a man who wrote taunting letters to the press claiming to be the culprit. This led Dillon to a psychiatrist, Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, who was obsessed with the case. And here is where it gets strange. DeRiver became convinced that Dillon was the culprit. Under hypnosis, or perhaps just intense psychological pressure, Dillon began to reveal details. He seemed to know things about the crime scene, things that only the police and the perpetrator could possibly know. He talked about Elizabeth Short's time, her movements, her life. The cops were electrified. They thought they had their man. But here's the kicker. It all fell apart. Dillon was, by all accounts, a pathological liar and a manipulator. Was he the culprit, or was he a deeply disturbed man who had simply read every newspaper clipping and fed the psychiatrist exactly what he wanted to hear? There was a problem with the timeline, and Dillon eventually sued the police for harassment. Just like that, another perfect suspect turned to dust. The Mad Butcher's Ghost. But perhaps the most grounded of the wild theories is also the goriest. It's the theory that the Black Dahlia wasn't the work of a Hollywood madman at all, but the final victim of America's first true serial fiend, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Years earlier, in Cleveland, Ohio, a monster had stalked the city. Between 1934 and 1938, the Mad Butcher dismembered at least 12 victims. The press called it the torso murders because in many cases, that's all that was left. The culprit was never caught. The similarities to the Black Dahlia case are bone-chilling. The Cleveland victims were often bisected with surgical precision. The perpetrator was methodical, clean, and never left a trace. The prime suspect in Cleveland was a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney, an alcoholic but brilliant surgeon who had connections to law enforcement. He was never charged. So, the theory goes, what if the perpetrator just moved? What if he left Cleveland and came to Los Angeles looking for a new hunting ground? The bisection of Elizabeth Short, the clinical precision, the posing of the body. It was all a signature. It was the Mad Butcher returned. But just like in Cleveland, the trail went cold. It was another compelling theory with no hard evidence to back it up. The son's obsession. And that brings us to Steve Hodel. When Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, began digging into his own past in 1999, he wasn't just chasing shadows, he was following a trail of evidence that the original investigators had, perhaps intentionally, ignored. Steve Hodel spent the rest of his life, from that moment until his passing, on a relentless campaign. He wasn't just a son pointing a finger, he was a detective laying out a case, brick by agonizing brick. He wrote best-selling books, Black Dahlia Avenger, presenting his mountains of evidence to the world. He accused his own father, Dr. George Hodel, of not only being the Black Dahlia's perpetrator, but also of being a prolific serial culprit, a monster responsible for numerous other unsolved cases in Los Angeles and Chicago, including the Red Lipstick murder. He even suggested his father was the infamous Zodiac. That part was perhaps a bridge too far for many. It was too much. It sounded to the public just as wild as the Orson Welles theory. He faced ridicule, of course. People called it a son's twisted obsession, a desperate grab for fame, but he also gained serious, powerful supporters. And get this, the head deputy district attorney for Los Angeles County, Stephen Kay, publicly reviewed all of Steve's evidence. Kay, the man who famously prosecuted Charles Manson, came out publicly and stated that based on his review of the evidence, the case against Dr. George Hodel was very, very strong. He said that if Hodel were alive today, he would have no problem prosecuting him. This was a massive wow factor. This wasn't a blogger, this wasn't a crackpot theory, this was a prosecutor's endorsement. So what do you think? Was George Hodel the monster, or was the real monster the corrupt system that let him get away? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe.